Today we're in Matthew 14, and Matthew 14 recounts two of Jesus' most famous miracles. For many of you, these miracles might be synonymous with Jesus Christ. Like when you think of Jesus, these might be some of the first scenes you think of. In fact, I had, my first ever Bible, when I was 5 years old, had on its cover a picture of Jesus performing one of these miracles. And so from my earliest memories, these miracles stand out to me as, if you want to know a little bit about Jesus, let's start at this place. But I'll say this, if these miracles are familiar to you, if they're kind of new to you, I would just say this, don't be surprised. You'll see more and more stuff like this. The miracles we see Jesus perform today in Matthew 14 are just what he does over and over again. Don't be surprised. You'll be in awe. You'll worship him if you believe he really did these things. But don't be surprised. Like, oh, I can't believe he can do that kind of stuff. Believe he can do this kind of stuff. If these stories are familiar to you, maybe you know them really well. Maybe you could get up here and tell these stories. I want you to enjoy them today, though, through maybe a slightly different lens from what you're used to. Enjoy them through the lens of cruciformity, the cross-shaped life. Enjoy them while thinking of Jesus, the Almighty, who is also gentle and lowly. Let's review then what we're up to this year at Calvary. We're hoping this year at Calvary to learn to live the cross-shaped life. The technical term for that, cruciformity, means this. It's learning to embody the self-sacrificial love of King Jesus, which God always deserves and always honors. It's this cruciformity teaches this idea that God doesn't always make things easy in this life for his people, but he always makes it worth it. And Jesus himself is the proof of this. Everything about Jesus is humble self-sacrifice for the glory of God and the good of others. From birth to literally death, everything about him is humble. And yet because of that life he lived and the death he died, God brought him back to life and made him King of Kings. That's cruciformity. We're learning Jesus' story this year. The humble downward trajectory of the Son of God, all the way to the point of laying his life on the cross, leads to his divine exaltation by his Father as King of the universe. We're also learning cruciformity, though, not just through the story of Jesus, but the teachings of Jesus. The Beatitudes, which serve as the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, communicate this idea of cruciformity. The Beatitudes are the cross-shaped attitudes of God's upside-down kingdom people. And we're memorizing all 8 Beatitudes this year. Today we're starting on the 5th one. We're on the 5th Beatitude of 8. And so I wanted to read the first 5 together. If you have some of these memorized, wonderful. You feel free to close your eyes and say them with us. But we're going to put them up on the screen. I think there's the first 3 at least. But we'll put all 5 up there, and you can read along or say them along with us, okay? Here we go. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Now, today we're going to look at a couple of these super familiar stories from Matthew 14. Before we get into it, I just want us to remember these stories actually happened. The miracles we're about to read about actually happened. Were actually performed by a human being who's also God in the flesh. These things happened in real time and space. Sometimes it's easy, if you've heard this story a million times, to forget just how stunning and amazing these feats are. So let's get into it. We're going to look at these 2 stories, multiplying food and walking on water. And one of the things that I want us to notice as we get into them is that Jesus did not simply work these miracles. As impressed as we might be, he's not trying to impress us. He's not trying to impress us. He's trying to do 2 things. He's trying to glorify God, and he's trying to meet people's needs. Jesus could have used this power to indulge himself. He could have used this power to impress the masses. But instead, he's about honoring God and being a blessing to people. Here's the 2 miracle stories. The first one, Jesus miraculously fed a hungry and hurting crowd. We'll start in verse 14, or chapter 14, verse 13 here. But I want to, before we get into it, though, I do want to set us up from where we were 2 weeks ago when we ended halfway through chapter 14. If you recall correctly, at the beginning of chapter 14, Herod, the king of the region Jesus was ministering in, heard rumor about Jesus' ministry, the teachings, the healings, and he thought Jesus was John the Baptist come back from the dead. And then we get this flashback in the first third of John 14 about the unjust and brutal execution of John the Baptist. John the Baptist had called Herod out for his divorce and remarriage to a woman he should not have had, and Herod didn't like that, put John in prison, so John becomes like a theological, political prisoner of Herod, and Herod eventually decides, through a circumstance we don't have time to get into, to put John to death. So that's the setting when we begin with verse 13. Rumor of John's death and also of Herod's suspicions about Jesus, that he might be John the Baptist raised from the dead, is getting back to Jesus. So here we are in verse 13 of chapter 14. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So Jesus tries to get alone with the disciples. We don't know, is he grieving John's death? Is he trying to drop out of the spotlight of Herod's attention for the meantime? We don't know exactly what the motivation is. It seems to be connected. But whatever the case, Jesus is trying to get alone, probably with his disciples. But we've seen this happen before in Matthew's accounts. Jesus cannot escape the crowds. The needs of this world continue to press in on him. The crowds are desperate for Jesus and the kingdom of heaven he has brought into their midst. They can't get enough of him. And so they follow Jesus and they find him, and his heart just breaks, his compassion for all of their needs. The ill, the blind, the lame, the mute, the deaf, every single one of them continue to come to him and beg for healing. So Jesus spends the whole day ministering to this crowd. Now, Jesus, if you think about it, the one who said, let light come out of darkness, right? Just let there be light, and there was light. He could have just spoken over the crowd, be healed. But that's never how Jesus healed. He never just waved his magic God wand and just every need is fixed right then and there. Jesus would take time with individuals to meet them where they're at, to meet them in their faith, even if it was little, and to bring them healing. So Jesus spends time with this crowd, ministering to them individually, and it takes the whole day. And all that time spent out in the middle of nowhere leads to another massive need. The crowd is getting hungry. My stomach literally feels like it might start to growl, so I apologize if that happens in the middle of speaking up here. I literally am feeling it coming on, so I'm getting hungry. Every time I say that word, I feel it. But anyways, verse 15, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. So while Jesus is busy healing all day long, the disciples begin to notice this new need. They're getting hungry. Not only that, they're a long way from town, and it's getting late. In just an hour or two, maybe, it'll be too dark for these men, women, and children, this huge crowd, to be able to travel safely and to easily find dinner, a place to stay for the night. And so even though Jesus was meeting the needs of the sick, the disciples assumed that the crowd was going to have to fend for themselves, that they must meet their own need of hunger. It's a fair assumption. The disciples concluded that they would not be the ones who would need to feed this hungry and hurting crowd. And honestly, I share the same reaction of the story. As I'm reading this, my hard heart assumes that this is a need these people are going to have to figure out on their own. Yeah, if you're blind, you're going to need Jesus for that one. If you're lame, you're going to need Jesus. But if you're hungry, you should have brought your own lunch, right? You should have planned ahead. You see that they're the ones that have traveled all this way, bothering Jesus with their needs and coming unprepared in the first place. But that would be an incredibly self-centered conclusion, thus showing my heart, right? And thus showing the disciples' hearts. You see, the disciples planned ahead, as we will see in a few verses. They have with them already 5 loaves and 2 fish, just enough for the 13 of them, 12 plus Jesus. But here's the thing. Desperate people don't always plan ahead. Some people have such a basic, more dire need that they're not thinking about lunch, but they want to see. They want to walk. They want to hear. They want to live another few months. They're not thinking about lunch. See, healthy people plan ahead, and they should, because they can. But hurting people don't always do that. If the disciples had Jesus' compassion, they would have known this. And so Jesus urges them, as always, he's making disciples. He urges them to participate in his ministry. They may not at this moment be able to open blind eyes or help lame people walk, but what they can do is make preparations for lunch. They can help in that way. They can meet the need of hunger. And so Jesus replied to them in verse 16, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, Jesus. I added the Jesus there. They answered. Okay, so I understand what's going on here. The disciples had planned ahead, but they'd only planned ahead for 13, not for thousands. So this is fair. Part of the reason the disciples would not feed the crowd was because the disciples believed they could not feed the crowd. Their amount of resources here are limiting their imagination on what Jesus can do, understandably. Their math is correct, you could say. 5 loaves of fish, or 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish is just enough to feed 13, but not the masses. Now, here's the thing, as we'll see, it's more than enough for Jesus. In verse 18, Jesus says, bring them, meaning the loaves and the fish, bring them here to me. And he, Jesus, directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Can you imagine what the disciples were thinking when Jesus told them to start passing out their own lunch to the crowd? Can you imagine that? But all their concern must have left in a hurry as they realized the miracle Jesus was performing in their midst. As they began to break apart those 5 loaves and pass out those 2 fish, Jesus creates food where there was none before. I have no idea how he did this. He's God. Again, he said, let there be light, and there was light. Some scholars attempt to explain away this miracle here by suggesting that, when Jesus encouraged the disciples to share their own lunch, everybody else in the crowd, a few had brought their lunch, they started to share. And so maybe everybody shared their meals and got a little bit, and that was enough for them. That's not what Matthew says. That's clearly not what Matthew says. You can't explain away this one. I mean, I'd like to see him explain away the next one. Can't explain away this one. This is a miracle. Plain and simple. It's reminiscent of how God fed Israel in the wilderness. After he delivered them from Egypt, he had done so much for them, but now here they are on the run in the middle of nowhere. And they're hungry, and they're complaining about God, and they're rebelling against God. And yet God sends miraculous bread, manna from heaven, to feed his people in Exodus chapter 16. Bread from nowhere. The punchline of this account is amazing. They all ate and were satisfied. 5,000 men, plus women and children. I mean, we're talking 20,000 people ate from the disciples' lunch. That's more people than the population of Fruitport Township. Imagine if all of Fruitport showed up right now in our parking lot. We wouldn't even fit, first of all. Next, we wouldn't even have enough gluten-free crackers and grape juice to feed everyone. This is a miracle. King Jesus rules a kingdom of abundance. Do you see what God can do with just a little bit? And though the sacrifice might seem small, It's more than enough for Jesus to use to accomplish his purpose of feeding these people. All the hungry were satisfied. Now think about this for a second, though. Of all the things Jesus could do with his power, he fed the hungry and the hurting who had nothing to offer him. These are the weakest of the weak, the poorest of the poor. And he feeds them with his divine power. Here's the second story I want to look at, the second account. When I use the word story, sometimes I feel like you might think I'm making it up. I'm not. This is an account, a historical account from Matthew. Who was there? Here's the second one. Number 2, Jesus walked on water to rescue his disciples. So the meal bought Jesus more time with the crowd, more time to minister, more time to finish what he was doing among them. And once he was done, he and the disciples made plans to leave. Here's how that happens in verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside to pray, or by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. So several of Jesus' disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John, were fishermen, experienced fishermen. It's before they started following Jesus full time. That was what they did. They were fishermen. They were out on the Sea of Galilee all day long. And so they would have been able to traverse the lake, which is this is no small lake. The Sea of Galilee is about 10 times the size of Muskegon Lake. It's quite large. That's why they call it the Sea of Galilee. But the weather was a struggle, even for them. It should have only taken them 2-3 hours maybe to sail across the widest parts of the Sea of Galilee. But here they are in the early morning hours, still struggling, still out in the middle of the lake. They've been out there since the evening. They've been out there all night, struggling. Can't make any headway against this wind with the waves crashing overboard. Now, Jesus wasn't with them. He was praying on a nearby hill. He had gone across the lake to go to a solitary place, and he couldn't find any rest. And so he sends them across, and then he goes off after he finishes ministering to the needy crowd, and he's spending time in prayer with his Father. But he must see them because he heads straight out to them in the middle of a lake without a boat. He's walking on water, people. When I was little and I heard this story, I thought, well, I could probably try that. So I might go over to a friend's house where they had a pool, and I'd get a running start, and I'd make it like one step before sinking beneath the water, right? Like Jesus didn't need a running start. He went about 2 miles out into a lake, walking on water. Now, he's not just walking across the lake. I mean, that must have been his plan because they left with the boat. His plan must have been, well, they'll leave with the boat and I'll just catch up with them later. Again, walking on water. But Jesus is not just crossing the lake to get to the other side. Jesus is crossing the lake to rescue his flailing disciples who are about to go under. In verse 26, here's what happens as he approaches. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." See, Jesus tries to reassure his disciples here with a special word. He says, between take courage and don't be afraid, he says, "It is I," which literally reads something like "I exist" or "I am" in the original Greek. If you're familiar with Exodus chapter 3 and how God revealed his special name. You know, God's not his name. His name is Yahweh, or I am. God reveals to Moses in Exodus chapter 3 that special name. In Hebrew, I am is pronounced Yahweh. And in the Old Testament, it's that God who goes by that name, the I am, who for Moses and Israel trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's armies. It's that God, Yahweh, who parts the seas. And then Israel begins, when they're delivered, begins to sing, there's Yahweh, there's no God like you. Jesus is identifying with Israel's God, with the disciples' God, by saying, it is I am. What a weird thing to say. I exist, I am. He's revealing his name. They don't need to be afraid, because of course he can walk on water. Of course he could part the sea. Of course, as we'll see in a second, he'll calm the storm. But verse 28, the story continues. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you in the water. Verse 29, come, Jesus said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. I really don't understand why Peter says this. Why is he using this test? I'm terrified of the waves and the wind. I'm terrified of the ghost. But Lord, if it's you, why don't you tell me to... I have no idea why he asks this question. I read so many commentaries, theologians, trying to figure out why he asks this. Lord, tell me to walk to you on the water. I still can't quite figure it out. If you have an answer for me, you can tell me later. I think the best explanation I had is this, is that Jesus has been teaching and commissioning his disciples to participate in his ministry. That's what he's been doing. Jesus, they're not just passengers along for the ride. They're to be learning how to minister to the people Jesus is coming into contact with. And so all the way, you might remember in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus gave his disciples authority over disease, over demons. Jesus was teaching them how to minister in God's name on this earth, how to bring the kingdom of heaven into this world. So maybe Peter's thinking, well, this is something new. I've never seen my master do this before. And so if this is really Jesus, I want him to invite me to participate in this newly revealed power, walking on water. And so Jesus does. He invites Peter to walk on water for just a moment. Verse 30. But when he, Peter, saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Or, Lord, save me. I don't know. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, Jesus said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. So for just a moment, Peter trusts Jesus. But then the wind and the waves capture his attention. They erode his faith for just a moment. See, Peter's a failure here, but I'm so thankful for him. First of all, I'm thankful for Peter because of his transparency. Most leaders in any part of the world, in any institution, in any group, organization, government, nation, whatever, most leaders don't want other people to know their failures and their weaknesses. But not Peter. Peter was one of the first leaders of Jesus' church in its earliest days. And yet he made sure these stories of his own failure were told over and over and over again, so much so that eventually these stories were told. Matthew, one of Peter's friends, wrote it down and says, this is a really important part of Jesus' story. It's Peter's story of his own failure, of his own weakness. See, Peter wanted people to know, future disciples to know, everybody to know how much Jesus loves failures and how much he transforms them. I'm really grateful for Peter. I'm also thankful for Peter because he's me, he's you, he's all of us. We struggle, we doubt. We take our eyes off Jesus and look at our problems. We're too broke or too busy. We're too lonely or depressed or anxious, too whatever. But Jesus gives us what we need to worship him, namely the cross and the resurrection. Jesus gives us what we need to learn from him, his word, and to serve him, his church. So if Jesus is allowing us to struggle, it's only to learn dependence on him, which will bring him glory in the end. And if Jesus is allowing us, so to speak, to walk on water, it's only to bring him glory by being a blessing to others in their lives. So in short, I'm really thankful for Peter because his testimony points me to Jesus. Does yours? Does mine? Verse 34 is how the story concludes. Jesus and his disciples get to go on a really nice long vacation. No, I'm just kidding. When they crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And the men of that place recognized Jesus. And they sent word to all the surrounding country. And people brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Of course he did. Of course, this is how the story ends. Jesus cannot help but drive back the darkness and brokenness in this world. He continues, even after all this, to pour himself out for others, for the crowds, for his disciples, and for you and I as well, as we watch him continue in the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Matthew. We'll see Jesus show us his true nature as the cross-shaped king, and the true nature of his kingdom as the cross-shaped kingdom. But 3 quick lessons as we wrap up today. Number 1, no one's as powerful as the Son of God. No one's as powerful. Both of these miracle accounts connect the Jesus of the New Testament to the God, the Yahweh of the Old Testament. Yahweh parted the seas to save his people, and Jesus walked on water and stilled the storm to save his disciples. Yahweh fed his people in the wilderness with manna from heaven, and Jesus multiplied 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed the masses. In Matthew, Jesus is literally retracing the steps of God as he saves his people from their greatest enemies, ultimately, Satan, sin, and death. And once we're safe in Christ, we're safe from everything. No one's as powerful as Jesus. Second lesson, though, no one's as humble as the Son of God. It's not just that Jesus is powerful. That just leaps off the pages of these accounts. It's how he chooses to wield his power. What would you do with the power of God at your fingertips? Would you feed the needy masses? Would you rescue the doubting disciples? Seriously, if you had a genie in a lamp right now, would your wishes be about you or about the glory of God for all peoples? Jesus is just different. This cruciformity, look at how he's choosing to use his power. Third lesson, though, and this one we'll sit on for a second. You can trust the Son of God with your service and with your trials. You see, cruciformity, the cross-shaped life, is an invitation to serve people sacrificially and endure trials faithfully while trusting Jesus to take care of the rest. That is what it is. We can trust him in our service. You know, we want to be a church for our community. We want this to be a place, a gathering of God's people where God causes spiritual and cultural renewal for his glory and others' good in and through us. I mean, that's what we want. Spiritual and cultural revival. Our time, talent, treasure, and testimony are our 5 loaves and 2 fish. To us, they don't seem like a lot. They may not seem like they can impact a community, let alone change a whole world. I mean, there are so many problems in our homes and neighborhoods, let alone with this world. I regularly hear people talk about how bad this world is. Yeah, I think every human being agrees that this world is, we disagree on what's bad about it sometimes, but everyone sees some aspect of the brokenness in this world. It's bad. And I don't know about you, but I feel, and I think Calvary is super inadequate to do anything of meaning. I don't just feel that way. We are super inadequate to do anything. Apart from Christ. Apart from Christ, we can do nothing. But in Christ, anything is possible. Nerd moment, Lord of the Rings. Here we go. In the movie, The Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, and I can't remember if this part's in the book, but it's epic. I definitely remember it from the movies. There's a king and his army, and they're devastated and surrounded by countless evil orcs, okay? And this king says, so much death. What can men do against such reckless hate? And his brave companion standing by his side, he thinks for a moment, and he answers, ride out with me. Ooh, getting chills right now. He says, ride out with me. Ride out and meet them. And their little force charges out bravely into the army of evil orcs, and it's really inspiring and awesome until they're very easily overwhelmed. There's like 10 of them to 10,000. Until, and spoiler alert, I'm really sorry. I mean, it's been 22 years at this point, so if you haven't seen the movie, at least that's your fault. Spoiler alert. I'm glad the 4th and 5th graders left, because maybe they are, just going to read those books or something. But spoiler alert, their wizard friend, an ally, crests a nearby hill right as the sun dawns, and behind him is a whole army of reinforcements, and they swoop down into the valley and defeat all those countless orcs. And the brave companion remembered when he said, ride out with me, ride out and meet them. He remembered that help was on the way. His wizard friend had promised to come, had promised to bring reinforcements, and that they only needed to hold on a little longer, and help did come. And it made everybody in the theater yell and cheer. We might have all the grit, resources, and wisdom in the world, but without the crucified and risen King Jesus, our ministry as a church is nothing. But with him, anything is possible. He is the decisive difference in being a church for the community. But we can also trust him in our trials, not just in our service. What are your storms? Are you lonely, longing for friendship? Maybe that's your storm. Maybe you think, I may never have friends unless I compromise my faith, my obedience to Jesus. Or maybe you grow envious and even destructive toward those who don't seem lonely. Maybe you're jealous, and maybe that's your storm. Maybe that's your trial. Loneliness. Trust Jesus and do what's right and good. Are you single? Desperate for a partner? And you may think, man, I'll never find a husband or a wife until I give in to sexual temptation. Maybe that's your trial. But trust Jesus. Have self-control in your relationships and your sexuality. Trust him. Are you concerned about your financial situation? Maybe that's your trial, your storm. You may be tempted to take your eyes off Jesus, to lie, to steal, to take advantage of other people or their generosity. But trust Jesus. Be content. Work hard, even in less than ideal situations, but trust Jesus. Are you freaking out over the government or upcoming elections or whatever? Maybe that's your storm. Maybe that's your trial. Trust Jesus. Be a good citizen. Pray for your leaders, whoever they are. Use your rights and privileges for good. See, Jesus works miracles. We don't have promises that he'll work them for us every single time in this life. He's not making this life easy for you and I, but he's making it worth it. He's done it before. He'll do it again. And so my prayer is that the miracle worker will meet your need today and glorify himself in that.